Michael Jordan was driving his fancy black car through his old hometown in Wilmington, North Carolina. He was supposed to be looking for a place to build a new community center for kids, but his mind was busy thinking about a big meeting he had later that day. He missed a turn and the GPS told him to go a different way. As he stopped at a red light, he looked out the window and saw different people walking by, a mom pushing a stroller, two teenagers laughing, and then an old woman struggling with heavy grocery bags. Something about her seemed familiar, but he couldn't remember why. Just then, one of her bags ripped and her groceries spilled everywhere. A can rolled across the sidewalk and an orange bounced into the street. Without thinking, Michael parked his car and jumped out to help. Cars behind him honked, but he didn't care. "Let me help you, ma'am," he said, picking up the groceries. "Oh, thank you, young man," the woman said, not looking at him yet. "These old hands don't work like they used to." Michael picked up the last can and handed it to her. When the woman finally looked up, her eyes got big with surprise. "My goodness," she whispered. "Michael? Michael Jordan?" Michael looked at her carefully, and then it hit him. He knew her. "Mrs. Henderson?" he asked in shock. "Mrs. Eleanor Henderson?" She nodded and smiled wide. "I can't believe it's you after all these years." Michael stood still, memories rushing back. Mrs. Henderson had been his fourth-grade teacher. She had helped him with math when he had trouble. She had written him a kind note when he got cut from the high school basketball team. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked. Her smile faded just a little. "Oh, I live just down the block now in the Pinewood Apartments," she said, pointing to an old brick building. The paint was peeling and the stairs looked rusty. Michael frowned. Pinewood Apartments was not a nice place to live. "I have my car right here," he said, pointing to his SUV. "Can I give you a ride home? Those bags look heavy." Mrs. Henderson hesitated. "Oh, I don't want to be a bother." "It's no bother at all," Michael said firmly. He carried her groceries and helped her into the car. As they drove the short distance, Mrs. Henderson asked about his family, his business, and his charity work. She never once mentioned basketball, which made Michael smile. When they reached the building, Michael insisted on carrying her groceries upstairs. The elevator was broken, so they had to climb 3 flights of stairs. Michael noticed that Mrs. Henderson had to stop a few times to catch her breath. Her apartment was small but very clean. The curtains were old and the furniture looked like it was from a long time ago. But there were books everywhere, on tables, shelves, and even stacked on the floor. "Would you like some tea?" Mrs. Henderson asked kindly, as if it was normal to have a famous basketball player in her home. "I'd love some," Michael said, even though he never drank tea. As she went into the kitchen, Michael looked around. He noticed a bucket in the corner, catching water from a leaky ceiling. Then he saw a picture on a side table. It was a class photo from many years ago. A group of kids stood beside Mrs. Henderson. Michael's eyes widened. There he was in the back row, a skinny little boy with a big smile. "You kept this picture all these years?" he asked when she came back with the tea. "Of course," she said, sitting down carefully. "That was my favorite class. So many bright young minds." "How long did you teach at Ogden?" Michael asked. 40 years, she said proudly. "I retired about 8 years ago." Michael's smile faded. A teacher who worked for 40 years should have enough money to live comfortably. So why was she in a broken-down building with a leaky ceiling? "Mrs. Henderson," he asked gently, "are you doing okay? Do you have enough money for everything you need?" Mrs. Henderson looked down at her tea and sighed. "I'll get by," she said quietly. "Things got hard after my husband, Harold, passed away. Medical bills, you know. And we lost our house." She stopped talking and then sat up straight. "But enough about me. Tell me what brings you back to Wilmington." Michael told her about the new community center his foundation wanted to build. But his mind wasn't really on that anymore. He couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Henderson. This woman had helped so many kids, including him. She had spent her life teaching and now she was struggling. That didn't seem right. As they kept talking, Michael made a silent promise to himself. He didn't know exactly what he would do, but he knew one thing for sure. He was going to help Mrs. Henderson. When it was time to go, he made sure he had her phone number saved in his phone. "It was so wonderful to see you, Michael," Mrs. Henderson said as she stood at her door. "You've made an old teacher very happy today." "The pleasure was mine," Michael said, and he truly meant it. "And Mrs. Henderson, I'll be in touch soon." As he drove away, Michael picked up his phone and called his business manager. "Mateo," he said, "cancel my meetings tomorrow. Something important has come up." "But sir," Mateo began, "the investors have flown in from—" "Reschedule it," Michael interrupted. "This can't wait." He hung up before Matteo could argue. Michael wasn't used to explaining himself, and right now he had no time to waste. The next morning, Michael sent Mrs. Henderson a message, asking if she would have breakfast with him. Her reply came quickly, "Sure. How about Denny's on Market Street?" Michael chuckled to himself. He had planned to take her to a fancy restaurant, but Denny's was just fine. When he pulled into the parking lot, Mrs. Henderson was already waiting outside. She was wearing the same blue coat, but now she had a bright scarf around her neck. She looked smaller in the daylight, more fragile. "Good morning, Michael," she said with a big smile. "I hope I didn't mess up your schedule." "Not at all," he said, holding the door open. "I'm glad you could meet me." Inside they sat at a booth near the back. A young waitress walked up, looking tired, until she saw Michael. Her eyes went wide. "Oh my gosh, you're—" "I'm just a man having breakfast with his teacher," Michael said gently. "Could we get some coffee, please?" After they ordered, pancakes for Michael, oatmeal for Mrs. Henderson, he leaned forward. "Mrs. Henderson, I hope you don't mind me asking," he said, "but I can't stop thinking about your situation. What happened after you retired?" She stirred her coffee slowly. "It's not a very exciting story," she said. "I love teaching. I did it for 40 years. She smiled. Then the smile faded. "My husband Harold and I had a nice little house. We planned to travel after I retired." Then she looked down. "But Harold got sick. Cancer. He fought it for 3 years, but—" She shook her head. "The insurance helped, but it didn't cover everything. The special treatments, the home care, the medical equipment, it all cost so much." Michael listened carefully. His heart felt heavy. This wasn't just about Mrs. Henderson. This was happening to teachers all over the country, and he was going to do something about it. Michael nodded as he listened carefully. "We had savings, of course, but it wasn't enough. We had to borrow more money for our house. After Harold passed away, I couldn't pay for everything with just my pension," Mrs. Henderson said. She looked out the window. "I sold the house 2 years ago and found a small apartment. It's not much, but it's what I can afford." "What about your family?" Michael asked. "Do you have children?" "No, we were never blessed with children," Mrs. Henderson said with a small smile. "But I had my students, thousands of them over the years. That was enough for us." Their food arrived, and for a moment they stopped talking. Michael watched as Mrs. Henderson slowly cut her oatmeal into small pieces, like she wanted to make it last longer. "How much is your pension?" he asked. Mrs. Henderson looked uncomfortable. "That's not something I usually talk about." "I understand," Michael said quickly. "I'm sorry if I asked too much." She sighed. "It's okay. It's about $1,700 a month. But after paying for rent, electricity, and my medicine, there's not much left. Some months, I have to choose between buying medicine or food." Michael felt angry. This woman had helped so many children learn, and now she was struggling to live. "Did you ask for help?" "Oh, I did," she said. "I get some help with my heating bill in winter, but my pension is a little too high to get other help." She smiled sadly. "I have too little money to live comfortably but too much to get help." "What about teacher retirement benefits?" "Our state doesn't have the best retirement system," she explained. "And I started teaching before they made better rules to protect teachers. Bad timing, I guess." Michael shook his head. "That's not fair after everything you've done." "Now, don't you worry about me," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "I had a good life. I got to do work that mattered." She reached out and patted his hand. "I got to teach wonderful children who grew into amazing adults. That's worth more than money." But Michael wasn't sure. "Tell me about your apartment. That leak in the ceiling, how long has it been there?" "Oh, a few months now," she said. "The building manager says he'll fix it, but they don't have enough workers." She waved her hand. "It's just a little water." "And the elevator? It's always broken?" "The stairs are good exercise for these old bones," she said with a chuckle. But Michael didn't smile. "What about your health? You mentioned medicine." Mrs. Henderson looked down at her oatmeal. "Just the usual for someone my age. Blood pressure, arthritis, a heart problem that needs checking." Then she brightened. "But enough about that. Tell me about you. I followed your career, you know. I still have all the newspaper clippings." "You kept articles about me?" Michael asked, surprised. "Of course. Every game, every championship, every business you started. I have scrapbooks full of them." Her eyes sparkled. "I used to tell my students, I taught Michael Jordan. Not basketball, though, that you figured out yourself. But I taught you fractions." Michael laughed. You taught me more than fractions, Mrs. Henderson. Call me Eleanor, please. You're not in 4th grade anymore. Michael shook his head. I don't think I can. You'll always be Mrs. Henderson to me. They spent the next hour talking about old classmates and teachers. Mrs. Henderson remembered students from 30 years ago like she had just seen them yesterday. She asked about Michael's children, his divorce, his businesses. She even knew about his baseball career before he returned to basketball. I watched every game I could, she said. Sometimes I had to go to a sports bar to see the playoffs. The other teachers thought I was crazy, an old lady cheering at the TV. As they finished breakfast, Michael noticed Mrs. Henderson wrapping half her toast in a napkin and putting it in her purse when she thought he wasn't looking. His chest felt tight. Let me drive you home, he said. Thank you, but I need to stop at the pharmacy first. It's my day to pick up medicine. I'll take you. At the pharmacy, Michael waited in the car to give her privacy. Through the window, he saw her talking to the pharmacist. The pharmacist shook his head, and Mrs. Henderson dug through her purse, counting bills. When she returned to the car, she looked calm, but Michael noticed her bag was smaller than he expected. Everything okay? He asked. Just fine, she said cheerfully. They were out of one of my medicines. I'll get it next week. Michael wasn't fooled, but he didn't push. After dropping her off, he sat in his car thinking. He had a huge house, private jets, and millions of dollars, while Mrs. Henderson had to count money for medicine. He picked up his phone and called his business manager, Mateo. I need you to find out everything about teacher pensions and retirement benefits. And find me the best elder care lawyer in North Carolina. What's this about? Mateo asked. Michael looked at Mrs. Henderson's old apartment building. It's about doing what's right. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Mrs. Henderson's leaky apartment and how she had to choose between food and medicine. He remembered how she helped him with math, never making him feel stupid, and how she cheered for him when no one else did. Most of all, he remembered when he didn't make the varsity team in high school. He had hidden in the bathroom, crying. Somehow, Mrs. Henderson had found him. She didn't say the coaches were wrong. Instead, she gave him a note that said, "Failure is not falling down, Michael. It's staying down." Those words had helped him through every tough time in his life. And now Mrs. Henderson had fallen, not because she failed, but because the system had failed her. By 3:30 a.m., Michael had a plan. He would help Mrs. Henderson, of course. But what about other teachers like her? How many had given their lives to teaching only to struggle in their old age? At 9:45 a.m., Mateo called. Michael, I've been calling for an hour. Are you okay? Michael sat up, awake and sure of what he needed to do. I'm fine. Better than fine. I know what we need to do. Sir? Meet me for breakfast in 30 minutes. Bring a notebook. We've got work to do. Michael went downstairs to meet Mateo, who was already waiting with his tablet and notebook. What have you found out? Michael asked. Mateo told him about Mrs. Henderson's pension, her rent, and her health problems. Michael did the math. Less than $900 a month left for everything else. I want to buy her a house, Michael said, and set up a trust so she never has to worry about money again. Mateo nodded. That's very generous. We can do it in a week. Good. But that's just the beginning. Mateo looked up. Sir? Michael pushed his plate away. I kept thinking about this all night. It's not just about Mrs. Henderson. It's about all teachers like her. And I want to help them too. Mrs. Henderson isn't the only teacher living like this. There are thousands of teachers who spent their whole lives helping kids learn, but now they struggle in their old age. You want to help other teachers too? Mateo asked carefully. Yes, Michael said. I want to start a foundation to help retired teachers who don't have enough money. Mateo raised his eyebrows but stayed serious. That's a much bigger job than helping one person. I know, Michael said. That's why I need you to find a team. We need lawyers, money experts, and people who understand education. How much money are you thinking of using for this? Mateo asked. Michael said a number so big that even Mateo, who was always calm, looked surprised. That's a lot, Mateo said. It has to be, Michael said. This isn't just giving away money. This is fixing something that's broken. Teachers should not have to count every penny after spending their whole lives teaching kids. I agree, Mateo said. But setting this up will take time. Then we better start now, Michael said. He took out his phone and showed Mateo pictures of Mrs. Henderson's small, old apartment. For now, I want Mrs. Henderson to have a better home right away. Start looking for a good house today. Mateo took notes. What about her pride? From what you told me, she might not accept help easily. Michael had already thought about that. We'll make it seem like she qualified for help because of her years as a teacher. She doesn't need to know the money is from me. That's a smart idea, Mateo nodded. And about the foundation? Mateo asked. Keep it a secret for now, Michael said. No news, no announcements. We'll tell people when everything is ready. As they planned, Michael felt excited. This wasn't like making a new shoe or opening a restaurant. This was about helping someone who had helped him when he was a kid. After breakfast, they had a plan. Mateo would start looking for a house that day. Michael would go back to Chicago the next day to put together a team. One more thing, Michael said before they left. I want someone to check on Mrs. Henderson while we set this up. Someone nice who can help with groceries and take her to the doctor if she needs it. I can hire a nurse, Mateo said. Michael shook his head. No, she would notice that right away. It has to feel natural. My assistant, Daria Chin, is from this town, Mateo said. She's visiting family here this week. Maybe she could check on Mrs. Henderson as a volunteer. Perfect, Michael said. Make sure she gets paid well, but Mrs. Henderson can't know she works for me. As they left the restaurant, Michael felt happy. He had become rich and famous through basketball and business, but this felt different. It felt right. Back in his hotel room, Michael called Mrs. Henderson. I'm heading back to Chicago tomorrow, he told her. It was so nice to see you, she said. Don't be a stranger. I won't, Michael promised. Also, a community volunteer might stop by to check on you sometimes. Her name is Daria. The city has a new program for seniors who live alone. That's not necessary, Mrs. Henderson said. Just give her a chance, Michael said gently. She's new and needs the experience. Mrs. Henderson chuckled. You're still a smooth talker, Michael. All right, I'll be nice to your Daria. After they hung up, Michael looked out the window. His plan had started. Mrs. Henderson would get help right away. Other teachers would get help too, but that would take time. Michael smiled. Mrs. Henderson had told him a long time ago that he was special. He had done well in basketball, but maybe this would be the most important thing he ever did. The next morning, Michael flew back to Chicago. Usually he slept or watched basketball videos on the plane. But today he stayed awake reading papers that Mateo had given him about teacher pensions. The more he read, the more upset he got. Many retired teachers got less than $30,000 a year. Some got even less than that. And in some places, teachers didn't even get Social Security money like other workers. This is worse than I thought, Michael said to himself. By the time his plane landed, he understood the problem much better. This wasn't just about a few teachers. This was about a whole group of people who were not being treated fairly. At his office, Michael canceled all his meetings and called his top employees. I need everything we can find about teacher retirement benefits, he told them. State by state, history, expert opinions, everything. His employees looked confused. This wasn't something their company usually worked on. Is this for a new business plan? One of them asked. No, Michael said. It's for something more important. For the next week, Michael read everything he could. He talked to experts and learned more. The more he learned, the more he wanted to help. Mateo called with news from Wilmington. He had found a nice house for Mrs. Henderson near her church in a park. The house was being bought secretly so she wouldn't know it was from Michael. How soon can she move in? Michael asked. 2 weeks if the renovations go well, Mateo said. We're making it easy for her to get around. We're adding ramps, fixing the kitchen, and putting safety bars in the bathroom. Good, Michael said. And the money? Everything is set up. She'll get money for her bills, health care, and anything else she needs. She'll think she got it from a teacher support program. Great job, Michael said. Now let's think bigger. He took Mateo to a meeting room covered in charts and papers about teacher pensions. Did you know some teachers get less than $20,000 a year after working for 30 years? Michael asked. Mateo shook his head. I had no idea. Neither did I, Michael said. But now we do. And we're going to do something about it. He pointed to a picture of Mrs. Henderson in the center of the board. She's just the beginning. The next morning, Michael met with his advisors. I need the best people, he said. Not just business experts, but people who understand education and retirement. Mateo nodded. Any names in mind? Michael gave him a folder with names he had researched. Why are there basketball players on this list? Mateo asked. Because they understand teamwork, Michael said. And most of them had teachers who believed in them just like I did. Plus, their names will get attention when we go public. Slowly the team came together. Experts, lawyers, business leaders, and even retired basketball players joined. "Why did you say yes?" Mateo asked one of them. "Because my mom was a teacher," he said. "Her pension isn't enough. This problem is real." Back in Wilmington, Mrs. Henderson still didn't know about the house. "She showed me old photos of you," Daria told Michael. "She kept everything, team photos, newspaper articles, even a birthday card you made her when you were a kid." Michael smiled. Mrs. Henderson had always believed in him. Now he was going to do something big to help her and many others. Michael and his team were now meeting 3 times a week to make a big plan. They called it the Second Bell Foundation, named after the school bell that rings at the end of the day. This foundation had 2 big goals: helping retired teachers who didn't have enough money, changing the way the country takes care of retired teachers. Michael was involved in everything. He went to every meeting, asked hard questions, and wanted big ideas. This wasn't just about giving money. This was personal. "We need to think big," Michael told his team. "I don't want to just help a few teachers. I want to change the way teachers are treated in this country." Brave, one of his team members, nodded. "If we're doing this, let's do it right. Go big or go home, right, MJ?" The group laughed at the basketball joke, but they were serious. They wanted to change lives. As they planned, Michael talked to some of his famous friends and business contacts. He didn't tell them everything yet. Instead, he would casually say, "I might have a project coming up, something to help teachers. Would you be interested?" Almost everyone said yes. Actors, musicians, and rich business owners all had stories about teachers who changed their lives. They wanted to help. At the same time, in Wilmington, a house was being finished for Mrs. Henderson, a retired teacher. It had fresh paint, new appliances, and even a garden full of roses, her favorite flower. Everything was made to be perfect for her. "When do we tell her?" Mateo, one of the team members, asked. Michael thought for a moment. "Let's test our system first. Find 5 other retired teachers who need help. Let's see if our plan really works." So they quietly helped 5 teachers in different cities. A retired science teacher in Denver who lost his home after getting sick. A school librarian in Atlanta who was living in her car. A music teacher in Seattle who had to choose between heating her home and buying medicine. 2 elderly sisters in Boston, both former teachers, sharing a tiny apartment because they couldn't afford rent alone. Michael's team found homes, healthcare, and money for them. The results were amazing. The science teacher cried when he got the keys to his new apartment. The librarian thought it was a scam until someone helped her move into a safe home. The 2 sisters called it a miracle when they moved into a bigger apartment together. Rachel, one of the team members, was emotional. "It's working," she said, tears in her eyes. "We're changing lives." Michael nodded but stayed serious. 5 down, he said softly. Thousands more to go. 1 week later, the house for Mrs. Henderson was finally ready. Michael flew to Wilmington to check it himself. The house was simple, cozy, and strong just like her. He looked at every detail. Grab bars in the bathroom in case she needs support. Wide doorways so a wheelchair could fit in the future. Lower kitchen counters so it would be easier for her to cook. Bookshelves in the living room, waiting to be filled with her favorite books. A garden with raised beds so she wouldn't have to kneel to plant flowers. "It's perfect," Michael said. "She's going to love it." Mateo asked, "Does she know yet?" "No," Michael said. "She thinks she's moving into another small apartment tomorrow." The next day, Michael waited nervously. When the car arrived, Mrs. Henderson looked confused. "This isn't an apartment building," she said. Daria, a volunteer, smiled. "No mistake, Mrs. Henderson. This is your new home." She looked at the house, then at Michael. "Michael, what is going on?" she asked. Michael walked up to her, took her hand, and smiled. "Welcome home, Mrs. Henderson." Her eyes filled with tears as she realized what was happening. "You did this, but I can't possibly accept this," she said. Michael spoke firmly. "Yes, you can. You deserve this. You worked 40 years as a teacher helping students like me. Now it's time for someone to help you." Mrs. Henderson slowly walked through her new house. She touched the furniture, looked out the windows, and opened the cabinets. When she reached the bedroom, she saw her clothes already hanging in the closet and her photos on the dresser. "My books?" she asked in a small voice. "They're coming this afternoon," Daria said. "Every single one." Mrs. Henderson sat on the bed, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." Michael smiled. "You don't have to say anything. Just enjoy it. You've earned it." Michael left feeling happy, but he knew this was just the beginning. There were thousands of teachers like Mrs. Henderson who needed help. But as they tried to expand, problems appeared. Many teachers were too proud to ask for help. Some states had laws that could stop retired teachers from getting extra money. It was hard to find teachers in need without breaking privacy rules. Some rich donors started questioning the idea. One billionaire asked, "Why only teachers? What about firefighters or nurses?" Michael started to doubt himself. Should the foundation help more than just teachers? Was he being too focused because of his personal connection to Mrs. Henderson? One day his tax lawyers suggested using complicated tricks to save money. Michael got angry. "That's not what this is about," he said. "We're not trying to cheat the system. We're trying to help teachers." Feeling frustrated, Michael flew back to Wilmington. He didn't tell anyone. He just needed to see Mrs. Henderson. When he arrived, she was sitting on her porch, reading. "Michael, what a wonderful surprise," she said. But then she noticed something was wrong. "What's the matter? You look troubled." Michael sat down and told her about the problems, the laws, the doubts, the rich people who didn't think teachers needed special help. Mrs. Henderson listened carefully. Then after a moment she smiled. She asked, "Do you remember when you were struggling with fractions in 4th grade?" she asked. Michael smiled a little, even though he was feeling unsure. "You stayed after school with me for weeks," she said. "You got frustrated. You wanted to give up. Do you remember what I told you?" "Patience, Michael," he said, remembering her words. Mrs. Henderson nodded. "Some of the most important things in life are also the hardest. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try." That night, as Michael drove back to his hotel, he kept thinking about what Mrs. Henderson had said. She was right. He had never given up on a challenge in basketball. Why would he give up now? Feeling determined, Michael picked up his phone. "Mateo, call the whole team for a meeting tomorrow morning," he said. "We have work to do." Over the next few weeks, Michael and his team worked harder than ever at the Second Bell Foundation. They found new ways to solve problems. Lawyers figured out how to follow different pension rules in each state. Money experts made sure retired teachers could get help without losing their other benefits. The foundation was making progress again. By now, they had secretly helped 23 retired teachers in 5 different states. Each success made Michael believe even more that they were doing the right thing. Michael wanted everything to be perfect before telling the world about the foundation. So they kept it a secret. But then something went terribly wrong. Sophia Park, a new worker, made a big mistake. She sent some important papers to a reporter by accident instead of sending them to the legal team. She had mixed up the email addresses. It was a small mistake, but it caused a huge problem. The reporter saw Michael Jordan's name in the papers and started asking questions. Soon, news articles appeared everywhere. Michael Jordan's secret project. What is the basketball legend hiding? MJ's teacher charity, real help or just a trick? That last one made Michael the angriest. Some people were saying he had only started the foundation to save money on taxes and make himself look good. Michael paced around his office angrily. "They don't know what we're really trying to do." Mateo, his friend and assistant, said, "Maybe we should say something. Tell our side of the story." "No," Michael said. "We're not ready yet. We still have things to figure out." But the media didn't stop. Reporters started looking for people who had been helped by the foundation. Most teachers didn't say anything because they were grateful, but some were scared of the attention. Then Michael got the phone call he had been dreading. He looked at his screen. It was Mrs. Henderson. Michael took a deep breath and answered. "Hello." Her voice was soft and worried. "Michael, reporters keep calling me. They're saying strange things about you and the foundation." Michael's stomach tightened. "What kind of things?" "They're saying you're using teachers like me just to make yourself look good," she said quietly. "One reporter even told me my house might not really be mine, that you could take it away when you're done using my story for your image." "That's not true," Michael said. "You know that, right?" There was a long silence. "I thought I knew," Mrs. Henderson finally said. "But Michael, I don't want to be anyone's good deed. I don't want my story to be used to make someone else look generous. Even you." "That's not what this is," Michael insisted. But he could hear the doubt in her voice. "Maybe," Mrs. Henderson said softly, "you shouldn't call me for a while. At least until this all calms down." The call ended awkwardly. Michael sat there, feeling empty. He had started this whole thing to help Mrs. Henderson. Now she felt used and embarrassed. That night, alone in his home office, Michael looked around. He saw his basketball trophies and business awards. But none of them mattered right now. Had he made a huge mistake? Was he hurting the very people he wanted to help? Should he shut down the foundation before it caused more harm? Michael picked up a photo from his desk. It was an old classroom picture from when he was a kid. Mrs. Henderson had kept the same photo for years. In it, he was just a smiling fourth grader. Now he felt far away from that boy. The next morning, Sophia Park, the worker who had leaked the papers, walked into his office. Her eyes were filled with tears. She thought she was about to be fired. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Jordan," she cried. "I didn't mean to do it." Michael took a deep breath. He surprised himself by staying calm. "It's okay," he said. "Mistakes happen." Sophia looked at him, confused. "You're not firing me?" Michael shook his head. "No. But I need to ask you something." Sophia wiped her eyes. "Okay." Michael leaned forward. "Do you believe in what we're doing here? Or is this just another job for you?" Sophia took a shaky breath. "My grandmother was a teacher for 37 years, she said. After she retired, she had to work as a cashier until she was almost 80. So yes, I believe in this more than anything." Her words hit Michael deeply. She understood why the foundation mattered. Maybe keeping it a secret was the real mistake. Maybe they needed more voices like Sophia's. For the first time since the leak, Michael saw a way forward. That night he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Mrs. Henderson and Sophia's words. At 2 a.m. his phone rang. It was Coach Reynolds, his old basketball coach. "Coach." Michael answered. "It's the middle of the night. I saw the news about your foundation," Coach Reynolds said. "Figured you might be awake." Michael sighed. "It's all falling apart, Coach. The media is twisting everything. Mrs. Henderson thinks I used her. I don't know if I can fix this." Coach Reynolds was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sounds familiar. Remember Game 5 against Utah? 10 seconds left. Down by 3. Everyone thought we were done." Michael smiled a little. "We won that game." "You won," Coach Reynolds said, "because you never gave up. That's your greatest strength, Michael. Not your jump shot. Not your defense. Your refusal to quit." After the call, Michael stood at his window looking at the city lights. Coach was right. He had never given up before. Why start now? By morning, Michael had made a decision. "No more secrets," he told Mateo. "No more hiding. Call an emergency meeting. And I want Mrs. Henderson there." 2 days later, Michael sat in a hotel meeting room. Beside him were Mrs. Henderson and 4 other retired teachers from the program. Across from them sat his foundation team. Michael took a deep breath. "I owe you all an apology," he said. "I started this foundation to help teachers like you. But I made a big mistake." He looked at Mrs. Henderson. "I treated you like people who needed charity instead of partners who could help make this better. That ends today." For the next hour, Michael explained everything. The teachers listened. Then Mrs. Henderson spoke. "Why didn't you tell me all this before?" she asked. "I wanted to protect your pride," Michael admitted. "That wasn't your choice to make," she said. "You should have trusted me." "You're right," Michael said. "I should have." Then he asked, "Will you help us build something that truly honors teachers?" Mrs. Henderson looked at him, then smiled. "Yes, Michael. We will." Mrs. Henderson smiled for the first time since she arrived. "Well, Michael, I always knew you had talent beyond basketball." The room filled with laughter, and Michael laughed too. He was happy to see Mrs. Henderson just like he remembered, kind, wise, and always speaking her mind. In the next few weeks, Michael's charity, the Second Bell Foundation, changed completely. The 5 retired teachers became the heart of it. They met with Michael's team to make the program better. Instead of having the charity decide which teachers needed help, they would ask other teachers. This way, teachers would feel respected when they got help. "Teachers trust other teachers," Mrs. Henderson explained. "They will accept help if it comes from someone who understands them." The charity's way of working changed too. Instead of rich people making all the decisions, retired teachers would now have half of the seats on the charity's board. This meant teachers' voices would always be heard. Michael also reached out to other famous people like athletes, actors, and business leaders. He spoke to them in a new way, more honest, more caring. "Do you remember the teacher who believed in you?" he would ask. "The one who helped you with math or encouraged your writing?" There are so many teachers struggling to survive after years of hard work. The response was amazing. His old basketball teammates gave money. Actors, musicians, and billionaires joined too. They all had their own stories about teachers who changed their lives. One musician said, "My 3rd grade teacher bought me my first guitar with her own money. Without her, I wouldn't have a career. I want to help." Even Michael's former basketball rivals wanted to help. One of them, Brave Carter, said, "You beat me in the finals twice, but I'll forgive you if you let me help teachers." My mom was a teacher for 30 years. Brave got banks to help teachers buy homes and plan for retirement. This is bigger than championships, Brave told Michael. Meanwhile, the Second Bell Foundation continued to grow. Through teacher groups, they found teachers who needed urgent help. Some couldn't afford medicine, food, or even a place to live. The foundation stepped in to support them. Michael reminded his team, these aren't just numbers. These are real people who spent their lives helping kids. Now it's our turn to help them. At first, the news reporters were negative about Michael's charity. But as they saw the real work being done, they changed their minds. Stories of helped teachers were shared. People started asking, why do we let teachers suffer after they've spent their whole lives helping kids? Mrs. Henderson became a strong voice for the cause. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but she knew this was important. She spoke on TV and in newspapers. We're not asking for big houses or fancy cars, she said. Just for teachers to live with dignity after working so hard for so many years. Her words touched people's hearts. As the official launch day of the charity came closer, things got even busier. They had raised over $50 million from donors. They partnered with companies to help teachers get homes, healthcare, and financial advice. The foundation had opened in 15 states, with plans to reach the entire country in 5 years. Helping teachers today is important, Mrs. Henderson reminded them. But changing the system so teachers never have to struggle in the future is the real goal. The night before the launch, Michael invited his team to his home for dinner. Mrs. Henderson sat next to him. Teachers, business people, and former basketball players filled the table. Michael raised his glass. 6 months ago, this was just an idea. Now it's real thanks to all of you. He looked at Mrs. Henderson. Tomorrow we tell the world what we're doing. Some will love it, some won't. But I wouldn't want to do this with anyone else. A retired teacher, Mrs. Thompson, smiled. I always told my kindergartners that the most important lesson is sharing. Thank you, Michael, for sharing your money, your voice, and your determination. Mr. Lewis added, and thank you for listening when we told you your first plan needed fixing. Most rich people wouldn't do that. Michael shook his head. The real lesson is mine. I've won championships and built businesses, but this is the most important work of my life. Later, Mrs. Henderson pulled Michael aside. I've been meaning to ask you something, she said. Why did you name it the Second Bell? Michael smiled. Do you remember what you used to say at the end of each school day? Mrs. Henderson thought for a moment. Then her eyes lit up. The second bell doesn't mean the end of learning. It just means you're taking it with you into the world. Exactly, Michael nodded. A teacher's second bell, their retirement, shouldn't mean the end of their dignity or security. It should mean they carry their legacy forward with respect. Mrs. Henderson squeezed his hand. Her eyes were full of tears. You really did listen in my class, didn't you? To every word, Michael said. And tomorrow the world will listen too. Launch day arrived. The sun was shining. Michael woke up feeling nervous like before a big game. But this wasn't about winning a championship. It was bigger. The event was held at Ogden Elementary School, where Michael had studied as a child and where Mrs. Henderson had taught. The gym was decorated with a stage and chairs. Reporters, teachers, and community members filled the space. Outside, TV cameras waited to capture the big announcement. Michael arrived early and walked around. The basketball hoops were still there, raised toward the ceiling. He smiled, remembering all the hours he had spent practicing in school gyms just like this one. Mateo, his advisor, walked up to him. Feeling nostalgic? A little, Michael admitted. I've come full circle. The teachers are in the library, Mateo said. Mrs. Henderson wants you to join them. Michael walked into the library and saw the retired teachers getting ready. They were nervous but determined. Mrs. Henderson helped Mr. Bennett with his tie. Miss Clark practiced her speech. Mrs. Thompson looked at an old photo album, and Mr. Lewis paced back and forth. Good morning, Michael greeted them. They all smiled, their nerves easing a little. There he is, Mrs. Henderson said warmly. The man who started it all. No, Michael corrected. You started it, every teacher who gave their best to their students. For the next half hour they reviewed their speeches. Many of the teachers who had already been helped by the foundation were there. Most had chosen to share their stories openly. They're proud to be part of this, Mateo said. As they should be, Mrs. Henderson nodded. There's no shame in receiving help after a lifetime of giving. At 10 a.m., guests started arriving. Officials, educators, and teachers from all over. The teachers who had been helped flew in to be part of history. Michael and his team gathered for final preparations. The media only knows you're making an announcement, Mateo said. They have no idea what it really is. Michael took a deep breath. Then let's surprise them. Mrs. Henderson touched his arm. Nervous? A little, Michael admitted. It's different from a championship game. You'll do fine, she assured him. Just speak from the heart. Michael smiled. Any other teacher advice? She nodded. Remember why we're doing this. Not for praise, but because it's right. Michael stepped onto the stage. The room fell silent. He took a deep breath. Good morning, he said. Thank you all for coming. He invited Mrs. Henderson to stand with him at the microphone. The old teacher stood up slowly and smiled as she walked beside him. When I was cut from my high school basketball team, Michael said, Mrs. Henderson told me, failure is not falling down, Michael. It's staying down. Those words changed my life. Today they are helping us all as we refuse to give up. Mrs. Henderson spoke next. Her voice was strong as she talked about how hard life can be for teachers after they retire. She spoke with kindness and strength. When she finished, Michael took the microphone again. The Second Bell Foundation starts today with $50 million, he said. But this is just the beginning. He looked at the crowd and smiled. I'm happy to share some big news. Every major sports league in America is joining us. The NBA, NFL, MLB, NHL, and MLS have all promised to help. Gasps and cheers filled the gym. Reporters quickly wrote down his words. Teachers wiped tears from their eyes. Michael continued, Together we are giving over $1 billion to help retired teachers and fight for real change. The gym exploded with applause. People stood up, clapping loudly. Cameras flashed as Michael turned to Mrs. Henderson. Her eyes were wide with surprise. Did you know about this? She whispered. Michael shook his head and smiled. Some of it just happened yesterday. I wanted it to be a surprise for everyone, including you. Mrs. Henderson squeezed his hand tightly. Cameras captured this moment and soon, it was on the front pages of newspapers everywhere. By that evening, the news had spread across the internet. Michael Jordan gives billions to help teachers. One headline read. Sports leagues join Jordan's teacher support mission, said another. From basketball star to hero for teachers, announced a third. People started sharing their own stories about teachers who had changed their lives. My third-grade teacher, Mrs. Davis, bought me glasses when my parents couldn't afford them. Now I'm a doctor, wrote one person. Mr. Gonzalez helped me learn English after I moved here. Now I teach literature, shared another. The foundation's website was so busy that it crashed. When it came back, thousands of people had signed up to help or donate. Back in his hotel room, Michael watched the news with his team. People have donated another $200 million just today. Mateo said, looking at his laptop. Teacher groups are calling this a huge moment for education, Rachel added. Even my mom called to say she's proud of me, laughed Brave. And she never says that. Mrs. Henderson sat quietly on the couch, shaking her head in amazement. Are you okay? Michael asked gently. I just never thought anyone cared about what happens to teachers after they retire, she admitted. The next morning, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. TV shows wanted to interview Michael and Mrs. Henderson. After thinking about it, they picked a few to say yes to. On one morning show, Michael said, At first, Mrs. Henderson didn't believe me. She thought this might just be for attention. Mrs. Henderson smiled and said, Can you blame me? But Michael proved me wrong. He really listened to us and built something that helps teachers with dignity. More people wanted to help. Some offered money, others had ideas for ways to support teachers. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some people said the government should be helping teachers, not private groups. Others thought teachers weren't the only ones who needed help. Michael responded, We aren't saying teachers are the only ones who deserve help. But every successful person had a teacher who guided them. That's why we're starting here. Mrs. Henderson also spoke up. No one chooses a job expecting to struggle for food and medicine after working for 40 years. A country that lets this happen has forgotten what really matters. Her words touched many people. Teachers everywhere felt seen and understood. But the work was just beginning. Thousands of retired teachers asked for help. The foundation worked day and night to assist them. Michael wanted to hear their stories. There was a 72-year-old English teacher who finally got the surgery she had put off for years. A retired couple didn't have to sell their house to pay their bills. An 80-year-old kindergarten teacher could move out of her son's basement into her own apartment. 1 week later, Michael got a call from the White House. The president wanted to meet him and Mrs. Henderson to talk about fixing teacher pensions. Politicians are feeling the pressure, Rachel said. When so many people care about something, leaders start to listen. State governments also reached out. Some were nervous, others wanted to help. The conversation had started. "This is how change happens," Mrs. Henderson said. "First, people learn about a problem. Then they get upset. Finally, they take action." 3 weeks later, Michael and Mrs. Henderson spoke at a government meeting. Before they spoke, Mrs. Henderson asked, "Did you ever think we'd be here when you helped me with my groceries that day?" Michael laughed. "Never. But I'm glad I did." "So am I," she said with a smile. "Though I still think you should have paid more attention in my math lessons." Michael laughed again. Even with all the attention, she was still his 4th grade teacher, keeping him humble. 6 months later, the foundation had a big office in Chicago with 87 workers across the country. Mateo came in with an update. 102 teachers now have safe homes, medical care, and money to live on. Michael nodded. "And what about the laws?" 3 states have fixed teacher pensions. 7 more are working on it. And the federal government might pass a new law. It was good news, but Michael still felt something was missing. The foundation was working well, but it didn't feel as personal anymore. Later, he visited a group of teachers the foundation had helped. They shared their stories with him, and he felt the connection again. Then he heard Mrs. Henderson say something that stuck with him. "This isn't about charity. This is about justice." That night, Michael couldn't stop thinking about those words. At 3 a.m. he called his financial team. "Set up a meeting tomorrow morning. It's urgent." The next day he made a big decision. "I'm giving most of my business shares to a trust that will fund teacher support forever." His team was shocked. "Are you sure? We're talking about billions of dollars." "I've thought about it," Michael said. "This isn't a quick decision. This will make sure teachers always have support no matter what." Later, he told Mrs. Henderson in person. "The trust is partly in your name," he said. "You've done too much already," she said. "No," Michael said. "I haven't done enough." As they watched the sunset, she told him something he never knew. "After you got cut from the basketball team, I wrote letters to college scouts, telling them to watch you." Michael was stunned. "You did that for me?" "Yes. And the next day, I gave you a basketball signed by the teachers to show that we believed in you." Michael smiled. "I still have that ball." "Sometimes," she said, "just believing in someone can change everything. And that's what you're doing now for teachers." Michael realized she was right. Helping teachers wasn't just giving back, it was passing forward the most important lesson he had ever learned, that someone cares. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more exciting stories filled with adventure, mystery, and unforgettable moments. Your support means the world. It keeps these stories coming and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.